Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you step by step how to draw a water droplet. This is a fun exercise even for complete drawing beginners. You don't need any fancy tools or materials, and you don't need any prior artistic skill or experience. This class was previously over on Skillshare, but I've decided to bring all my Skillshare classes over to YouTube. That's why this video looks a bit different to my other videos on the channel, and it's also a longer format. I hope you enjoy watching. The tools and equipment you need are very basic for this. I'm using the most basic equipment I can find to prove that you don't need anything fancy for this at all. The materials you require are simply a pencil, some paper, a pencil sharpener, an eraser, and something to blend the pencil graphite with. In this case, I'm just using a tissue. If you have a better tool to blend the graphite with, then absolutely use that. For the eraser, I'm using an eraser pen. This gives a smaller area of erasing because you want to be quite accurate and you want to remove graphite in small areas. So if you can find an eraser that's pointed, that's much better. If you can't, then try and create a point on a regular block eraser by just rubbing the eraser on all sides to try and create that pointed end. The paper I'm using is just regular printer paper. The pencil is one you can just pick up anywhere. There is no right or wrong pencil to use for this. Obviously, if you have a set of pencils that have a range of hardnesses, then that will be ideal, but just any regular pencil will do. I'm just using a HB pencil, which I think is a number 2 in the US. The very first lesson is going to be on the anatomy of a water drop. Water is transparent, so water droplets are all about light and shadow. You need to recognise where the lightest areas are and the darkest areas. That's why it makes a great exercise for just using pencil and simple shading techniques. I'm going to walk you through what to look for in a water droplet so that you can recognise where the lightest parts and darkest parts are and translate that into a drawing. This isn't from still life, this isn't from a photograph, this is just a sort of technical study of a water droplet. Once you've completed this task, you'll have the background know-how, the techniques and the confidence to then try and draw a water droplet from real life or from a photograph. The first thing you need to do is draw a shape like this, where you have the neck where the water droplet has run down, perhaps a glass background, and then the rounded actual droplet at the bottom. The droplet shape itself is not perfectly round, it's slightly bottom heavy, so it's thinner and small at the top than it is at the bottom. You then need to decide where the light source is coming from. In this case, I'm imagining sunlight or a lamp coming from the top left corner. The lightest part of the water droplet is where the light first hits it. The light then travels through the water droplet and creates an arc of light on the opposite side. This arc is most light in the centre and then gets slightly darker towards the ends of the arc. With regards to the outside of the droplet, we're imagining it on a flat, uncoloured surface. The shadows of the water droplet will form on the opposite side to where the light source is. That's because the water droplet will shield that area from the light. So since the light source is in the top left, the darker shadows will be in the bottom right area. We've already drawn where the light enters the water droplet and leaves it, but once it's left it, it doesn't just disappear, it falls onto the surface that the water droplet is on. This forms a tapered triangle of light, which gets darker the further away from the droplet you get. You really want the tail of the water droplet to taper more, so the top needs to be wider like this. And then it tapers down to the thinnest part, which is the neck, before it then gets wider and forms the actual droplet at the bottom. Water droplets come in an infinite number of shapes, and in real life they can have light sources that are all around it, from the back, from the front, and any direction, and there can be multiple light sources. So you need to take this anatomy of a water droplet as some kind of basic know-how and use this when actually drawing from real life. I have provided links underneath this video to various photographs of water droplets that you can use as reference or to try and copy as realistically as you can as practice after you've completed this class. This will show just the variety of water droplets there are, and no two are the same. To perfect your technique, drawing from real life is really helpful just because of the variety there is, and it'll help your drawing get better quicker. So let's begin drawing the actual water droplet. First things first, you need to do an outline of the water droplet. The tail of the water droplet tapers down from a wider area at the top, down to a neck, which then widens to form the water droplet. Remember that the water droplet itself is bottom heavy, not a perfect circle. Try and keep your line as faint as possible to start with, especially on the tail and on the side of the water droplet nearest the light source, in this case the top left side. I didn't do this because I was trying to create a strong line for the camera so everybody could see what I was doing, so I'm just erasing it now a little bit to make it a little bit lighter, but still I would say go fainter than what I have done. You can always darken lines later on, but you can't as easily lighten them. Next step is to mark out where the highlight will be on the water droplet, which is where the light from the light source in the top left corner will hit the water droplet first. This will be a kind of oval shape in the top left corner of the water droplet. Simply do a very faint bit of shading around that vague oval shape to give the impression of the water droplet thinning out towards the top and getting particularly thin at the neck of the water droplet and in the tail. I do a triangular area of darker shading just at the neck of the water droplet. Make sure that whenever you're doing shading that there are no straight edges on that shading. You want it rounded because the water droplet is rounded. Next thing is you need to add shading to the droplet to give the impression of it being a rounded 3D shape. You need to do a kind of arc of shading around the top left corner of the water droplet. You want to do it in a kind of rounded arc fashion so that it reaches everywhere except the bottom right corner and the centre. Leave the centre blank for now. You want it to be darker towards the edges than the centre, so it gets lighter towards the centre of the water droplet. If you ever see a water droplet, you'll know that it's most bulbous at the bottom, where it's bottom heavy, and at the neck, that's where it is thinned out a lot, and there isn't the volume of water there that there is in the droplet. So you need to give that impression in your drawing. Next step is to add the shadows on the right side and the bottom side of the water droplet. These sides are opposite where the light source hits the water droplet. So feel free to press down with your pencil on the right and bottom sides, because here this is where the light won't hit. From the anatomy of a water droplet lesson, you will remember that there is a triangle of light that leaves the water droplet in the bottom right corner, which is the opposite side to where the light hits the droplet. So leave the bottom right side blank for now, except for doing a thin outline. Remember that the shadows will get wider the closer they get to the bottom right corner, because here the water droplet is most bulbous and therefore casts more of a shadow. So you start with a thin shadow and make it wider the closer you get to where the triangle of light will next be drawn. So now you're going to very faintly outline that triangle of light in the bottom right corner. This triangle will remain highlighted throughout, whilst the area around it will be mostly in shadow. The outline down the right hand side of the water droplet, unlike on the left side, can be made dark with pencil. Remember that on the left side that's where the light hits it, so you don't want to be making a dark outline. Don't be shy with the shadowing around this area, because the deeper the shadow, the more contrast there is between the shadow and the light, which makes the water droplet stand out more from the page. So simply outline the triangle of light, so there is a small triangle right next to the water droplet, and this then gets more and more shaded, i.e. less and less light, the further it gets from the water droplet. So the triangle nearest the water droplet will be bright white, and this will decrease and taper away the further away it gets. One tip is to make sure that the outline of the water droplet blends in and is the same shade as the pencil shading that's next to it, especially on the left hand side. Actually on the right hand side, because it's in shadow, this won't matter, but on the left hand side where the light hits the water droplet, you don't want that dark outline. Remember from the anatomy of a water droplet class where there was an arc on the bottom right corner of the water droplet? This is an area you need to leave white because this is a highlight. So you need to shade all the rest of the water droplet with a very light shading in the centre and then an arc of progressively darker shading on the left and top sides of the droplet. Next, darken the shadows on the right and bottom sides of the droplet. Just deepen and darken those shadows. To the bottom right of the water droplet, where the triangle of light is, I like to add a little curve in there at the top of that triangle, just so it isn't such an obvious triangle shape, and it just makes it look more realistic. Most of the building blocks of this water droplet drawing are now in place, so you simply have to build on them. So you will repeatedly need to darken the outline of the droplet on the right hand side and the bottom side, and darken the shadows throughout this whole process until you get the impact you want. The next step is to use whatever you're blending with, in this case I'm using tissue, to blend the graphite together to get rid of the pencil marks. This gives a much softer effect, which really helps with the whole look of the water droplet. Because the water droplet is rounded, I like to blend in a circular motion. This adds to the rounded look of the water droplet. Try not to go too much outside of the lines unless that's the effect you're going for, and just try and blend all of the dark areas together as one and all of the light areas together as one. Try not to go into the highlights, or if you can't help it, don't go into the highlights too much, and try not to go from the shadows to the lighter areas with your tissue, because that will pull the graphite across from the darkest areas to the lightest. On the opposite side of the coin, you will have to repeatedly lighten the highlights because they might get smudged with pencil graphite and darken as you carry on drawing. So this is what your eraser is for. You'll constantly need to use your eraser to remove all the graphite from the areas that need to be the brightest. These areas are where the light hits the droplet in the top left corner, where it leaves the droplet in the bottom right corner, and then the triangle of light sitting to the bottom right corner of the droplet. Now all you need to do is keep repeating all of those processes until you get the look that you want. This means darkening and deepening the shadows, then blending the pencil shading, and finally using your eraser on the highlights. And you just keep repeating these steps until you are satisfied with the results. Notice that I'm not working on the tail of the water droplet at all, which is the area to the top. I am going to do that last because it doesn't need much shading at all because it's such a thin layer of water. Once you're happy with the water droplet, you can move on to shading the tail. I drew the outline to the tail too strongly and too harshly to start with, so I'm just erasing it a little bit. When you're drawing yours, make sure you only use faint lines and faint shading for the tail. What I like to do is do a little bit of shading down the edges of the outline, as well as shading a kind of V shape I like to leave a highlight on the left hand side because that's where the light source is, but you don't need to make it too bright, just lighter than the rest of the tail. You'll see that very little shading is required to give the desired effect here. I use my tissue to blend the shading, just to get rid of the pencil marks. You don't have to be accurate with this. You can use your eraser to go over any highlights you've put in the tail, like the one I have created on the left hand side here. And I'm also using the eraser to exaggerate the neck between the water droplet and the tail. Just do this until you're happy with it, but really all your attention should be on the water droplet itself, and the tail should be very quick to finish. And once you've done the tail, the whole drawing is done. If you want to improve your work, then these are a few things that you can upgrade to and make it a lot easier on yourself, as well as making your drawing have more impact. If, like me, you're using just a regular pencil you can pick up anywhere, then to improve your work, I would recommend buying a pencil with a softer graphite core. This is so that you can make your shadows much darker. If your shadows are darker, it means you have a much bigger contrast between the dark areas and the light areas of the water droplet. This will make your drawing create more of an impact and make it look more realistic. In the UK and Europe, the grading scale for graphite goes from 10H, which is the hardest graphite, to 10B, which is the softest. You might think you need a harder graphite to give you a darker shadow, but actually you want a softer graphite, because the softer it is, the more graphite is left on the paper as you drag the pencil across it. The softer pencil leads go from HB to 10B. Obviously, the higher the number, the softer the lead. The downside of a softer lead is that it smudges more easily, so you don't really want to go for the really soft leads like 9B or 10B, but perhaps use something like a 4B or 5B to get you started. Please feel free to look up the scale of graphite hardness that is used in your country to work out which pencils will be best for you. It could be an idea to buy a set of pencils that have a range of hardnesses so that you can give them all a go and see which is best and what creates the best effect. As for the blending, I just used a tissue, which obviously isn't completely ideal, but it's what most people have in their house. Blending stumps, or tortillions, if that's how you pronounce it, are a lot more accurate because they have pointed ends and so can be used for blending very small areas and you won't get smudges everywhere. Blending pens are also available, so they're really helpful. As for the eraser pens are quite a good choice, like I've used, but for removing graphite from particularly small areas, eraser pencils or kneadable erasers or putty rubber can be used because they can have a point, and the pointier you can get an eraser, the better it is for removing graphite in small areas. So if you're looking to improve your drawing technique and carry on drawing, these are a few materials that will be really helpful, and they're not expensive either. As for the paper, you can carry on using regular paper, or you can go for more textured paper, which will obviously create a different effect, although maybe not as realistic. Maybe it'll give a more artistic impression. But all these things you can experiment with and have a bit of fun. And that concludes this class on how to draw a water droplet. I really hope you've had fun.